Hello, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us today and taking your lunch hour to join the Defining the Challenge of Energy Transition. This is a webinar hosted by Arizona State University's Just Energy Transition Center. My name is Amanda Ormond. I am a professor of practice and the co-founder and director for the Just Energy Transition Center, which is a pretty small center, part of ASU. I'm joined here by a couple colleagues. I have Kit Batten, who's a professor of practice and a senior fellow at the Just Energy Transition Center. We also have Lauren Keeler, who's an assistant professor for the School of the Future of Innovation and Society, and she's also a director at the Just Energy Transition Center. And we also have Ty Wagner, who's our program director. The JET Center was formed several years ago to help communities think about and plan for the energy transition that's coming when our coal plants in the region close in northern Arizona and in southern Arizona. As a state, as communities, as utilities, we've never faced this type of systemic energy transition. And we know there's going to be challenges. And so the ASU is a resource to work with the communities and be able to support economic redevelopment and finding new ways to support our communities. You all know that there were 5 coal plants in the state of Arizona. 1 has already closed. There's 4 that are located in 4 counties still operating. There's more than 4 utility owners. So the system is complex. The purpose of this webinar series is, as we've been doing our work, we realize that there's many other states grappling with these similar issues. And we feel that by providing a cohort of people to talk about this, we can increase the opportunities to learn from each other, but also increase the amount and the type of transition support that can be provided to our impacted communities. The folks that are registered for this webinar today, you all are doing the hard work of transition. On this webinar, we have county representatives, community representatives, school districts, federal and state folks, utilities, and universities. There has been a significant amount of progress made in the last couple years. The 3 communities of Apache, Navajo, and Coconino completed an economic plan known as the Building Resilient Economies in Coal Communities. This is a plan that was put together, and they're trying to effectuate that plan and put it into place. That was a good piece of work to think about what could come next. I think that plant closures, it's more widely known and more accepted than it was just a couple years ago. There's greater coordination around transition impacts, and there's lots of planning going on in different forms. We've now got grant writing support. A couple years ago, communities were on their own and writing these big federal grants. Now there's opportunities to get grant writers to help us build our grant packages, although going after federal support can be challenging. The utilities are providing some support for match monies and for technical assistance. And there is an absolutely unprecedented amount of federal resources for coal communities, specifically our Arizona communities. Lastly, I think that there's a general agreement that addressing plant closures as a region, Navajo and Apache counties together, and Coconino, is more effective than trying to work community by community. So there's been a lot of progress, but we need a lot more progress because this is long-term work. We'll be doing this work for a couple decades. So Ty is going to put up a poll right now. We thought it would be good to start out this series asking you what brought you here. Why are you spending your valuable time with us to learn some things? So if you would, choose as many as you want, and I'm going to keep talking, and then we're going to show the poll in just a minute. But please choose the reasons that brought you to this webinar series. So the JET Center decided that we were going to do a series of 3 webinars. We've got a webinar today. We've got a webinar on September 3rd. That is a change date from the first email that we sent out. We're also hosting a webinar on September 10th. This webinar is being recorded, and all the webinars will be recorded in case you can't attend or in case there's someone else that you think would benefit from seeing these webinars. We'll have 3 presenters today that I think you're going to find fabulous, and we're going to follow that with questions and answers. On the bottom of your computer screen, you should see the Q&A function. We ask you to please put in questions anytime during the presentations, but put them in the Q&A function, not in the chat function, if you can do that. We are going to go to question and answers at the end, and I've asked my colleagues Kit and Lauren to assist me in going through the questions to make sure that we try to cover as many as we can. So I would like to see the poll. So Ty, can we show the poll results? Well, it looks pretty evenly split. I guess our number 1 answer was how to develop and implement a community transition. Great. We're going to capture all this information, and so if you go back to refer to it, you'll be able to see this poll again. So thanks very much, Ty. So now on to the content. One more suggestion. If you would, so people know who's in the webinar, the way that we've set this up, you can't see the participants. If you would like, there's 32 participants. If you'd like to put your name and your affiliation, that would be great. Although I can see the participants, I just don't know if everybody else can see the participants. Okay, so on to our speakers. We first have Gregg Martinez. He is the Director of Economic Development for the City of Page. Gregg is going to address for us the fiscal and social impacts of coal transitions on cities and towns from his perspective of working through Page, and maybe give some tips on how we can try to be as successful as Page has become in reinventing itself. So go ahead and take it away, Gregg.
Thank you, Amanda. Appreciate it. And thank you, everybody who's attending. First, right off the bat, I'm sure a lot of people who are part of these communities more or less wish that we aren't here talking about this, but this is where we're at. And I guess I'm the lucky person to launch it off regarding the fact that Navajo Generating Station closed 4 or 5 years ago. And is currently decommissioned. And I'll kind of give you a little bit of history about how that went. So I moved to Page in 2011. I was in a different field than I am currently now. And the power plant was a big part of the community, like it is part of every community. We first got wind that the power plant was going to possibly close in 14 and 15. And like anything else, there was a lot of grief that was going on. And a lot of people were in denial. And that carried on throughout many years of, is it going to close? Is it not going to close? And then once it was determined that it was going to close, we kind of moved through the stages of grief, which are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and finally acceptance. Once we went through that denial phase, which truthfully lasted until we saw the stacks go down, I think a lot of the grief that we went through as a community was circumvented because right around the corner, unbeknownst to all of us, was a global pandemic. We as a community were really relying on tourism. Page hosts anywhere between 4 to 5 million people across the world every year. That more or less fills the coffers of our bank accounts, and it allows us to continue as a municipality providing public service, providing new parks, paved streets, etc. And when power plant closed, there were a lot of questions about how we were going to continue operating as a community. And a lot of our response was, well, we have tourism that we're going to lean on. And we're going to continue to work it out until we can find a suitable replacement, if that exists, because it probably doesn't. And then the pandemic happened. And so I will tell you that if there's ever a silver lining in a global pandemic, it is to take away the after effects of a major employer closing. And while that was very difficult, it did allow us to rally as a community, which is, I think, a really important thing for those who are potentially about to go through this experience, is that you're going to really need to focus on who your champions are. We lost a lot of human capital. We lost a lot of human volunteers. We lost a lot of people in our community that volunteer for Little League, that volunteer for boards and commissions, that volunteer for Earth Day. And as a result, those who stuck around, those who were left behind, if you will, they picked up the mantle. And that really took us into the next stage of reinventing ourselves, which included lots of networking opportunities. In small towns, sometimes silos can be brought up, and we wanted to make sure that we were creating bridges and crossroads between both the closure of the power plant and the pandemic. As a result, we were able to work closely with our county representatives, with SRP, with Navajo Nation, and we tried to create a solution during that transitional period. And while it wasn't perfect by any means, we were, I don't want to say the guinea pig, but we were definitely the first one to be, first one to have a power plant closure, and the loss of those jobs and the loss of all the wonderful people in our community. I will tell you that it hasn't always been easy. I will tell you that there are still a lot of people who miss living in their home, and they come and visit, and they talk about how much they love living in Page. And while they're happy in their new communities, it's just not the same. But I'll also tell you that people like myself who want to see their city be prosperous pick up a lot of the extra slack and the extra duties. And I'll give you an example. Yes, I am the director of economic development. I was also the JV head baseball coach. I teach at the community college. I volunteer at nonprofits. And anything else that needs to be done when there isn't someone that wants to step up, I will typically take that. I'll take that lead. And that's honestly the most important thing I can tell you, is that please find, search out those people that are really invested in your community. Search out those people who are interested in seeing the community move forward. And they're all over. It's not necessarily just inside your community. Coconino Community, I'm sorry, that's the college I teach at. Coconino County actually was a great asset. I worked very close with our economic developer during the time of closure. And a lot of honestly, there aren't a ton of solutions right away. So it's important to have these kind of vent sessions where you're like, what am I going to do next? Or how do I respond to the community? And having those people surrounding you are really important, because the community is going to be looking at you. They're going to be looking at you for that lead of what's next. And, maybe I'm a little bit naive and too optimistic, but that was what I felt was needed at that time. We also worked closely with a couple other entities like Zion Bank, SRP again, and they helped us kind of strategize and create a formula of what could be next. They, I believe, helped funded target industry analysis, which was really impactful. They helped us with a housing symposium, because being in a major destination creates a lot of challenges for housing, as short-term rentals are very popular in this community. We have limited housing stock. And as a result, these VRBOs and short-term rentals, I shouldn't say VRBO, short-term rentals become more problematic as you're trying to recruit a new incoming business, because they're looking at the cost of real estate, et cetera. So it was really helpful that SRP, Zion Bank funded this target industry analysis. They helped us with the housing symposium so we could potentially recruit incoming developers. But also, because we were in the news in not a positive way. It gave the city access to politicians that we typically didn't have access to before. As soon as we moved past the denial, as soon as we moved into the acceptance, we were able to create a plan and work with those who could help us solve our problem. Don't be afraid to have sharp elbows. Don't be afraid to speak up. People are recognizing you now in these small communities. Maybe it's not the greatest news, and it certainly hurts a lot that something like this is going to take place, but don't not use this leverage to help you advance yourself to that next step, whatever that next step is. You can't please everybody. That's another key, is that, you want a group consensus. You want to make sure that you're using data, you're using evidence, case studies to help answer the why you're doing what you're doing next. Because a lot of the community members will go through these stages of grief much slower than those who are in charge. And so they're going to come at you confused, angry, displaced, despondent. And what I had in my experience was that when you have pieces of paper that doesn't say the city of Page says so or Gregg says so, but it's coming from a reputable institution, and you're like, look, this is the game plan we're going to have. That seemed to calm a lot of people down. That seemed to create a bridge instead of a silo. And that, I think, was honestly the most important thing we could have done, which is just be there for your community. Don't try to have every answer, because we're now 5 years removed, and we're still figuring it out as we go. We went through a pandemic, a mega drought. Not that any of you heard that we're having water issues in Lake Powell, but we went through all of these things at once, and we took every opportunity to make us stronger as a community. And that, to me, I think, was the most important, vital role that I was in, was that I was just human to human level with them, trying to tell them, I'm upset too. This is really jarring for me as well. I can't believe what's happening. And then all of a sudden, it's like, okay, now that we got that out of our system, let's talk about what it is you want to see happen. Let's talk about what it is we can do. And that is kind of why we're at where we're at. City of Page has rebounded. We, at the former plant, they repurposed it with a manufactured home builder in Zenny Home. They have, of course, they're not employing 600 people, but they're employing hundreds of people, which is a step in the right direction. One of the positive consequences, if you can say, is that when the stacks went down, there was a lot less of the yellowish stuff in the air. I don't know the scientific term for it, so I'm not going to say it, which seemed to increase a lot of visitation. And so we, at the end of the day, really relied on what our community wanted, what these studies were telling us, and then how we collaborated as a internal government, and then with the external forces like the county, the state, and federal representatives. We used as much attention as we could to help gain the access to resources that just aren't available to small communities like us. And with that said, that's more or less all I've got. And of course, I will take questions at the end. Amanda, did I go for 10 minutes?
You're muted. Amanda, you're muted.
Click on the draw.
Yep, sorry. Yes, that was perfect. I think we'll have lots of questions and answers about how you did what you did. So now we're going to move on to our second speaker. Our second speaker is Jeremy Callis. Jeremy kind of does a dual role. He is the superintendent for Tolleson Unified School District. He's also a co-founder of a consulting firm called True Professionals LLC, and they work with school districts on a whole host of issues, including the finances. So there is my friend Jeremy, and we're going to let you take it over. And I think you do have some slides.
I do. Good afternoon, everyone. So
Good.
yes,
Can
Jeremy
you make
Caius,
those- Can you make those full screen?
absolutely.
Thank you. Perfect.
All right. So good afternoon, everyone. Jeremy Caius. Yes, I am the superintendent of Tolleson Union High School District, but I am here under my capacity as owner for True Professionals, and between my two consulting companies, True Professionals and NGSB, I do work with over 60 districts across the state, 60 school districts. And I've been in school finance, Arizona school finance, for almost 2 decades now. So happy to be a part of this project. Amanda had pulled me in to do some financial analysis on a couple of school districts. And so there's some different ways that these closures impact school districts. I'm going to go over those. There's the impact on the tax rates, the impact that it has on their ballot initiatives, their per pupil funding, and kind of give you a sense of what the total financial impact is to a school district, and even throw out a couple of possible solutions on how we can try to make this a little bit more palatable for the districts that are going through this. Obviously not against moving towards clean energy, but we need to do it thoughtfully for these communities and these school districts that are experiencing these impacts. So first, I don't want to assume that everybody knows every term, so I'm gonna throw some definitions out there as I start talking about a couple of items. One of those is tax rate. So the tax rate is really just your levy divided by your assessed value. So the property values that you have for your community, all your businesses, homes, and everything else. That's really setting up your tax base. And depending on how much money you need, dividing that out, then that's how much you have to charge everyone. So, all of us, let's say if there was 10 of us, we wanted to chip in for a break room refrigerator and it cost $500, then the 10 of us, 10 would be our assessed value. The 500 we're trying to raise would be our tax levy. And you divide that out for a tax rate of, we each got to chip in $50 to get that refrigerator. And so consequently, when you have lower assessed value, you're going to have higher tax rates. And so when these plants are closing, they are decreasing the total assessed value of that community and driving up tax rates, which has impacts on school districts. So in Joseph City, that impact was that they were losing almost 2/3 of their tax base from the closure, and their tax rate was going to almost double. So that's what we're looking at for Joseph City. Pretty significant impact. So if all of a sudden, you're getting a letter from your mortgage company and they tell you that they're going to increase your payment pretty significantly, like you're going to start wondering why, and you're going to trace it back and see, oh my God, my tax rates have really shot up. All right, so we have a couple of different rates. So we have a primary tax rate that is made up of what's called a qualifying levy. Essentially, it's this attempt to try to level out across the state that we're all at least taxing to this minimum level to try to keep it balanced. So if you're in a property rich area, you're not necessarily having an extremely low tax rate compared to the rest of the state. We have a homeowner's rebate that when it's your home, there's a reduction of your taxes. So you'll often see on your tax bill, if you look at your tax bill for your property, you'll see something that says state aid credit. That's the homeowner's rebate. It's giving you back some of your primary property taxes. Some things are excluded from that calculation, like the difference between the two transportation numbers that we use, which is like historically how much transportation funding have you needed versus current year, how much transportation funding do you need? So that gets excluded from that calculation. Adjacent ways, which is a tax that districts can call for without an election. It's just a board vote because it can only cover safe egress and ingress into a property. So those are some examples of exclusions. And I'm only going into those details because when I get into possible solutions, like it's going to include some of these pieces. The Joseph City Unified School District, they are at the max qualifying levy, so they are fully taxing, which is not always the case for a lot of districts, especially in rural areas. You don't always see that. So then we get into the secondary tax rate. The secondary tax rate is more about a district's local initiatives. And so those can be a maintenance and operations override, which is capped out at 15% of your per pupil funding. It can include a district additional assistance override, which is capped out at 10% of your per pupil funding. So essentially between the two, you can get 25% more funding into a school district above the per pupil level, which sounds like a lot if you don't take into account that Arizona's per pupil funding is 49th in the nation. On bonds, it's not necessarily that we're capping on the rate, but we're capping on outstanding capacity, and that's driven by your assessed value. So that's based more on an ability to repay. We look at total assessed value, and that's going to set the cap on how much outstanding bond debt you can have at the time of a bond issuance. So those are important because they feed into the problem that's being experienced, as well as some of the possible solutions. So now for those overrides and the bonds, when you go out for those initiatives and a plan has closed down, it has an impact on being able to go forward for those initiatives that a district may have historically been successful with. First, it's going to change your voter demographic, because when your community loses a significant number of jobs, it's going to change your community, because a lot of those community members you have who were dependent on those jobs and have, young families with students who are going to school and everything else, and typically may have been supportive of the school district, they're going to have to move out. They're going to have to follow the work. So that's going to shift who's still left in your community and how those percentages break out. As you see with the Joseph City case, the tax is almost double. So that's going to change the voters' mindset. If their tax bill is doubling and you're coming forward and saying, I know that your tax bill doubled, but the district is actually having significantly less funding and we need more support. You're not going to find a lot of voters who just had their tax bill double and line up to go ahead and support the district on a lot of local initiatives that's going to drive that tax rate up even more. So the projection is that Joseph City will lose on their next M&O override election and not be able to renew that funding source. So in the analysis that was done, that was taken into account, the assumption that they would be unsuccessful. Now, again, this projection was based on most realistic scenario. I wish the best for Joseph City. I hope the community does support them and keeps that going. But the projection was that the next time they go out to the ballot, that would probably fail. And that financial impact then would be 6.9 million over the 10-year period that was analyzed. On the per pupil funding, in a lot of states, it is really your assessed value that is determining how much money a school district can have. They'll have millages, they'll be able to do a rate against that total property value. And so really that's driving a lot of the income that's available for the school district. But we're an equalized state and we have a per pupil formula. So the main driver of how much money is available to a school district is dependent on how many students they have. And so when you have less jobs, you'll have less families. When you have less families, you'll have less students. So you have to take that into account. And that impact on their per pupil for Joseph City then will be 13.2 million over 10 years. That's a projection. In Holbrook, that was also analyzed, looking at 18 million over a 10-year period from that loss of students. So when you bring up Joseph City losing their override, that brings their total impact to 20.1 million. They were only working with, at the beginning of this, a student count of 411. So that's a very significant dollar amount when you start to run that out on a per pupil basis. And again, that was for the entirety of the 10-year analysis. So that isn't a 1-year impact. That is the accumulated impact over a 10-year period. In Holbrook, 18 million. They do have a higher student count. So the most significant impact is going to be to Joseph City with that Cholla power plant closing. So it's going to be very difficult for both districts, extremely difficult for Joseph City. Now, a lot of times everyone's thinking, well, yes, the revenue is going away, but so are the expenses. Not necessarily. When you look on the expense side, let's say you have 81 first graders. Well, you're gonna need 3 teachers, and that's gonna be a class size of 27. If all of a sudden you have 9 less first graders, that's more than a 10% drop in funding. So now you have 72 first graders. You still need 3 teachers at a class size of 24. It's unrealistic that you would run 2 classes of 36. So that's going to be some difficult decision to make for them in regards to like, how are they going to manage this? When do they increase class sizes? When do they, start to lay off teachers if they can't do it through attrition? And because our state shift from a prior year funding to a current year funding system, the impact hits them immediately. So for all the districts that are going through this, like the impact is immediate. We used to be on prior year funding, so it was the student count from the prior year that drove your funding for the current year, but now we're on a current year system, so it's an immediate impact once the student count starts going down. When you look at some of the other expenses, your utility bills, if it's a class size of 27 or a class size of 24, you still have to cool the class. You still have to light the class. Like the utilities don't necessarily change, no material change in your utility costs just because there's a handful of less students in each class. Your site administration, you're still going to need a principal, right? So you're not going to proportionally reduce your principal's hours based on the classes being a little bit smaller. So your school secretary, all of that, they're still going to need to be present. The facility still needs to be maintained. If you have 90% of the students that you used to have, you don't cut 90% of the grass, right? You still cut the whole lawn. District administration is still pretty much going to stay the same. So when you look at all the expense side, you can't just proportionally reduce expenses. Some of these fixed costs are still going to be present, and you're going to take a bigger hit on revenue than what you can match on the expense side. So that's where the difficulty comes in for these districts who are going to be trying to manage these types of situations. So when we look at, if we were to try to acknowledge this situation as a statewide issue that we wanted to tackle, the state, there are some things that have precedence that we could implement if the state was to adopt this as a priority. And one of those is a rapid decline formula. So we used to have a rapid decline formula, and that's when we're under prior year funding. So even when we're under prior year funding, there was a rapid decline formula. And what that allowed for was when we had districts who would have some type of closure of a large employer within their boundaries, and we saw their student counts nosedive, the rapid decline formula allowed that they would have funding to help transition them down to their new student count. And then you didn't have to lay off teachers immediately, because through attrition, you could eventually get yourself to where you have the right number of teachers, and you didn't have to worry about in 1 year going from, okay, we're only 9 students less in first grade. I don't really want to go up to class sizes of 36. Like when you let that have a multi-year impact, then it's like, okay, now it's low enough that we could actually take the teacher, have meaningful class sizes that are not like unmanageable. And you had time. You had time to be able to be more respectful about those changes. On homeowners rebate and additional state aid, we could look at how we could address this through that formula, where maybe we're managing the impact to the tax rate by having less exclusions from the homeowners rebate for these communities. So that difference on transportation, Jason Ways, and a few other things, we could allow those homeowners rebates to not have those exclusions in these communities. And if the tax rate was more manageable for those communities, then it's possible that they would continue to support local initiatives. The state could offer some type of transition funding to try to mitigate these impacts. And more importantly, we can learn from history. While, you know, the coal plants closing, you know, may feel somewhat newer, we have a long history of major employers closing in these communities that are essentially built up and designed around that major employer, right? We have that through mining, we have that through other incidents that are more local to specific communities. Like, we could look back, look at those impacts, look at what was done to help them make the transition, and try to then come up with something a little bit more thoughtful on how we manage these closures, instead of just putting it on the district and telling them good luck. So that's about the extent of what I have, but I know we're opening up for questions at the end. So I'll turn it back over to you, Amanda.
Thanks very much. I think what we're going to do. Yeah, thank you. I think what we're going to do is we're going to take questions for Jeremy and Gregg, because you guys are very Arizona specific, and because Julia comes in with other state experience. I think we're going to kind of bifurcate it a little bit. So I'm going to lead off with a couple questions. Gregg, can you come onto video so we can see you? Great, thank you so much. Okay. The first question was, were there ways that you could figure out to identify champions in your communities? You said people went away, you picked up a lot of hats. Do you have any recommendations about when and how to find champions to lead efforts?
Yeah, you probably already know them. And sometimes it just takes a little nudge. I always work my inner network first. Typically my friend group, who I volunteer all the time to do stuff. But they're not far away. They're typically right by your side. So you just ask them to take on one more thing. And then if anything, you expand your network that way.
Okay. Can you elaborate on, you talked about coordinated planning, and I think you talked about some support from SRP and one of the banks to do some planning. What type of coordinated planning did you do for the community, thinking about what could come next or how to address issues?
Well, SRP and the county helped a lot in that situation. They created a workforce training program that focused on upskilling people who were transitioning out of the power plant industry and into something different. We poked our head in and saw that a lot of it had to do with digital and computers, technical stuff like that, IT. And so we went around that procedure of like, okay, well, we are a little weak when it comes to internet. We're weak when it comes to connectivity. So one of the first things we did was we brought in more infrastructure from the east, from a generous donation, a grant from the ACA. So Page has a crazy amount of internet, which is really funny because everywhere else doesn't. And once we were able to lock into things that other communities had that were maybe more populous than us, we then went to the target industry analysis, which brought 7 different type of industries that would be supported in Page. And then we started working towards the developers who would be willing to do so. You know, we turned over as many rocks and stones as we could, but when the developers came to us, we had the ammunition that we needed to say, this is why you should be here. And I think that really shocked them. A town our size, as I say, that not some of our council members like my tagline, but we are the middle of nowhere, but we are the center of everything. And so when they came to the middle of nowhere, we wanted to make sure that we were the center of everything, which includes data and information that you would get typically from like a GPEC, et cetera.
Sounds great. I also wanted to mention that AmeriCorps, which many of you have probably heard about, there is an application out right now if communities are interested in people support. So AmeriCorps Project has a proposal out right now where you can apply and get bodies. And it sounds terrible, but you
Yeah.
know, we lose people. We don't have people to work on transition. And the Arizona region has been identified by the federal government as somewhere where they can deploy AmeriCorps people for a solid year. So if anybody's interested in that, you can reach out to anybody at the JET Center. The last question, so the town did social media to raise awareness of tourism, or did other people do social media? So Horseshoe Bend is a big deal, and some of the other things you have. Who was responsible for the social media?
Well, whoever that first person that took the picture of the Slot Canyon or took a picture of Horseshoe Bend in 2012, thank you. That was as the kids call it, went viral. So that was a huge thing. And then we started noticing that we had no input on that narrative. And so when I was put in place, over marketing. And I was one of those people who had no idea that page existed before I moved here. And when I went down to conferences and people are like, "Where are you from?" I'm like, "I'm from Page, Arizona." Nails on a chalkboard, where is that? So I felt like we had a really great opportunity to enhance ourselves to our own state. And so I went to our city manager and said, "Hey, I think it's time for us to really focus on public relations, specifically within the state of Arizona." And so we brought on a social media specialist whose sole job was to show all the great things of Page, show all the great things about living in rural America. Because again, I mean, we really wanted access to resources that we didn't have. And everybody's on social media. Well, I'm not on social media, but most people are on social media. And as they're going through their feed, taking a 5-minute break, I wanted us to pop up very regularly. And then we started in with commercials that really just highlight the beautiful scenery of Page. And so it started before I even got involved with tourism and economic development. But we really took hold of it, honestly, during a lot of the negative publicity of the mega drought with Lake Powell. That was probably more impactful than the power plant closing, specifically for Page, only because, as Jeremy had said, we went through equalization back in 2000, where SRP was giving a lot of money to the city of Page, and to the school district, not to the city of Page, but to the school district and to nonprofits. And then when equalization happened back in the early 2000s, or 2000 in general, that money stopped coming freely to us and then went into a big pot that everybody shared in the state, which was the right thing to do. And so as a result, we had to start focusing on the industry internally. And one of our biggest industries was marine. And so that was when the mega drought news happened and people stopped coming to the lake. I would say that was, we'll just say, equally as impactful as losing the power plant.
Okay, great, thank you. Jeremy, a couple questions for you. So you had mentioned that the tax bill for Joseph City had doubled, but is that, the question is around, will that be experienced by other communities? And I think the answer is no, because of proximity to Joe City, to the Cholla power plant, because they were taxing it more. So their other communities will not feel that doubling of a tax bill. Do I get that right?
It's dependent on, yes, if the power plant is actually located within the school district and a part of their assessed value. So when you look at, neighboring Holbrook, but the power plant is in Joe City, so they're experiencing the hit on both sides, the assessed value and the reduced jobs and less families, less students. But Holbrook necessarily isn't feeling an assessed value hit, not directly. They're feeling it more from the loss of students. Now, indirectly, yes, a power plant closing, I would expect that all the properties may all of a sudden, with less jobs being in the area over time, like housing prices and everything else may start to go down. if the community is now overbuilt for its needs based on, having less jobs, if you're having houses sit unsold a long time on market, that's going to start to bring those values down. So over time, there will be more impact all around, but the direct hit is from the close of the power plant, immediately brings down those assessed values. And I know they're talking about bringing, another big assessed value there with solar and everything else. But even if they replace the assessed value, if they're not replacing the jobs, then they're not replacing the families, which means they're not getting the students back into the schools, and these school districts are still gonna feel a major hit. Gregg had touched on the fact that we have like multiple things happening at the same time. And that's one of the things that had to be looked at in this analysis, because in school districts right now, yes, we're dealing with the pandemic. Not all the students came back after the pandemic. We have low birth rates still from the Great Recession that are still cycling through our system. So you had these multiple things that are at play that are hitting the district, and that data had to be teased out of the impact to try to be fair to what was assessed to just the power plant closure, and had to do that by looking at peers and seeing what's being experienced by peers who, yes, everybody's student count is down, but these districts, it's down significantly more because of the power plant closure. So that data had to be teased out, but it's not that the school district isn't also experiencing other losses from low birth rates, pandemic, and everything else on top of these closures. So yeah, it's even if they can replace the assessed value, if we can't replace the families in that community, it's still going to be very difficult for those school districts.
Okay. You had mentioned the rapid decline formula. So
Yeah.
can you tell us a little bit more about that? That was something that the state had that supported cases like this or other things where there's a material change for a school. When was that in place? Why did it go away? You think there's any chance that that could come back? Is that something we should be advocating for? Can you tell us a little bit more about that history?
Yes, I would say, well, let me start with history. So we used to have this in place because it's not new especially for rural areas, to lose a major employer, right? That's something that's historically has happened many times before, especially, for Arizona specifically around mining. That's happened a lot with mining where mines have closed up. So it's not a new concept that we would lose a major employer within a rural community, and where that major employer may represent like 50, 60%, 80% of the jobs, of the assessed value, like that kind of stuff has happened before. And so we had for a long time a rapid decline formula, and we were funded on prior year. So let's say if your student count from one year to the next went down from 100 students to 80 students, and then the next year it's down to 60 students. Well, in year one, when you were down to 80 students, because we were prior year funded, you were still being funded at the 100. So that gave you time to say, oh my God, we only have 80 students, but we're still being funded on 100, so we don't have to fire anybody right away. Let's figure out how we're going to address this for next year. In that second year, when you went down to 60, the state would see like, well, you're declining pretty quickly here. Even though you're down to 60, we're still not only are we not funding you at 60, we're funding you at 80 because that was prior year, but from 100 to 80 was a pretty fast decline. We're actually going to fund you at 90 students. So in the year that you're 60, you're getting funded like you have 90. So you went from being funded like having 100 to being funded like you have 90. And by the year following, you're being funded like you have 70, even though you're going down further. And so it delayed the impact. It doesn't eliminate the impact. It just softens the blow. So you don't have to take it all just one year to the next. It delays the impact of your student count becoming, driving down. And eventually when your student count levels out, then you're no longer eligible for any rapid decline support, and you're funded back on what your student count is. But it delays the impact, it softens the blow, so that way you don't have to rush to make decisions, especially because our fiscal year begins in July, but we don't know how many students we have until August, when they actually show up. So it's hard, and you got to issue teacher contracts around March, April. So it's hard to figure out how many teacher contracts to issue in March and April when you don't know how many students you're going to have in August. So by delaying the impact, you're able to manage that a little more
And
realistic.
so when did that funding formula go away?
So it's been gone now for about a decade. The Arizona Tax Research Association was fighting that one along with a handful of other things that were in statute. So that went away about a decade ago. There is a group coming together now that is looking at a school finance rewrite because most of our system was put into place in 1980. So it's been 44 years. I mean, if any of us are still driving the same car or using the same cell phone from 1980, please raise your hand. No, there is a committee coming together with a possibility of having a school finance and the school finance formula proposed in 26. And rapid decline is coming up, not just for what's happening to these communities, but with the universal vouchers and how that's impacting, a lot of school districts, especially in the East Valley. You're getting more support for, we need rapid decline back. So I think you're gonna see a push. So you'll have allies in the push to try to get rapid decline back into the system, so we can manage when there's a significant drop in student counts.
Yeah, great. That's super helpful. The last question is, within the area of Apache and Navajo County and maybe Coconino too, what is the number of school districts that will feel an impact?
So I don't have that full analysis with me right now. I've looked at these two districts, and it's going to vary by school. So it's really it's a few different things that have to be looked at. What is the impact on their assessed value? What were they currently doing with local initiatives? Some of them may be on reservations where almost all their assessed value was, or at least close proximity to them, where all their assessed value. Their students aren't actually, their families aren't actually generating assessed value. So it's gonna vary by district.
Okay, I think what ASU did some research on, there's 13 school districts that could be impacted. Does that sound right?
Yes, that could be right, but how much each one of them is impacted will be based on their very specific situation, on where they're at and how much the plant made up of their community. Like, was it a significant portion? Did you have other major employers that could help mitigate some of the impact? So it'll vary by district.
Okay, last question. Do you know of this, is there anybody at the state that's looking at this to be able to work with, because I know you've done this work, but is there anybody at the state looking at, let's calculate what these school districts are going to lose? Is there any work being done on that?
No, unfortunately, so I know, like, often I get to work with a lot of school districts across the state, and I'll often hear the reference of, oh yeah, you're over there in the great state of Maricopa. I don't think we get enough attention to the rural areas and the challenges that they face. So like when something that like this comes up, downtown, like you'll hear everybody talk about, the Quasi-Meyer settlement and how that impacted Maricopa school districts and stuff like that. But like when we're having like a similar issue, like up north with Transwestern and Kinder Morgan, like I don't feel like you get the same level of attention if it's not happening to Maricopa and Pima County. So that
I think
some people may say that statement's unfair, but that's how it appears to me.
Yeah, I think everybody on this webinar might agree with that statement. So Gregg and Jeremy, thanks so much. I'm gonna let you stand by for a bit and we are gonna switch over to Julia Haggerty. So very pleased to have Julia here with us today. She is an associate professor for resource geography at Montana State University. She also works with communities on energy transition. I've personally known Julia for a decade or more and really appreciate her work. So over to you, Julia.
Thanks, Amanda. So great to be here. And am I coming through? Okay, Amanda, you can give me a, yeah. Okay,
Yes, yes.
So wow, you guys are so lucky. You're facing huge challenges and you have these amazing resources. You have people like Gregg, you have the JETC Center at ASU, you have someone willing to do the hard fiscal policy, number crunching, so important. So it's really just an honor to be here and share a little bit about my perspective, which is going to dial way back up to some more kind of generalities. So I'm a scholar. I'm interested really in the intersection of like how remote, thank you, how remote and resource dependent places can work on environmental, economic, social prosperity in the context of a world where they don't have much control often over the big policy and market forces that shape what's happening in their community. So I'm going to talk about what I think community resilience kind of looks like in the context of the US coal transition, just emphasizing that really, as you can see already from these examples, these are big complex issues with lots of forces and actors, and how local entities respond and the actions that are taken both locally and kind of with a network of partners regionally and in the state, even in the federal government, can really shape what the kind of impact is for places of losing this particular kind of large industry. So I want to really just talk about, offer you a general vision of what community resilience is based on a couple decades now of work in this context, and then just talk a little bit about what some of the common issues that are emerging in coal-dependent communities in the context of transition are, and I'll offer a couple of examples of some emerging strategies that are responding to these problems. And I want to just emphasize a couple of things before we get going. There is an interesting group of stakeholders on the call. I'm going to really emphasize the perspective, like, Gregg's perspective from the community looking out. But I think depending on who you are, when we talk about what some of the challenges are and what some of the solutions are, you can ask yourself, like, what is the role that my organization or my entity has in kind of addressing this challenge? Because everybody does have a role to play. While it is a local issue, it's also an issue really nested in a big network of stakeholders and policies. I've got a lot of slides here that are pretty graphical. If it goes too fast, I'm happy to share them. And I want to just acknowledge that this is not only my own work, but the work of featuring some great nonprofits, some of my former students, and lots of great reporting. Thank goodness we have reporters to keep working and sharing the news on these issues. So as I said, I've been doing this for a couple of decades. I really started to think about how local places respond to big shocks in energy economies in the context of the shale boom. This is us out in the Bakken, and this is kind of what our work is, working with local communities and local leaders to understand economic changes happening in their communities, and then for us to take a step back and ask kind of how that fits into the larger policy space, and where does resilience kind of come from in that intersection. So out of work we did actually in the shale boom, I came up with what I think is a pretty simple definition for community resilience. It's one of those buzzwords you hear about all the time. So in the context of something like a big shock, the loss of a major employer, even a big shock like Gregg talked about, a big natural disaster like a drought, we think of community resilience as, can the residents in a given place exercise agency? Can they self-organize in response to change? And there's lots of kind of ways of breaking down a definition of this. What I've learned over the years is that it really comes down to these kind of 4 essential factors. And you will have heard some of this, particularly in Gregg's presentation. You really need people, individuals who are willing and able to take leadership. When a shock comes, it's really helpful if there's an existing process, a way of working together, so that people aren't inventing how to do planning or how to draw on the different resources of different agencies for the first time. So process is super important. Something that really distinguishes how one place responds versus another is vision. Is there a commonly held and forward-looking set of values and beliefs about where your community is going? And then finally, this issue, again, Gregg hit on this, that networks are so key. So a community can have a great vision, they can be really good at working together, but these are small places typically that are going to really need external resources, whether it's something like bringing in that policy expert to do the school finance impact assessment, you need to know where to go to get that information and ideally have some resources to bring that information back. So this is like my very simple definition of community resilience, and I think it does apply in the context of the plant and mine closures that we're seeing not only in the American West, but really across the country. So let me just talk about kind of what is unique in the context of plant and mine closures. One thing that's unique is that every place is unique. We've been looking at this kind of across the American West now for quite some time, and there are some common trajectories, but there also are remarkable differences. The size of transition payments, the kind of transition support that different communities are able to pursue, how long communities spend in those different phases of grief, what the scale of the demographic shift is. All of those things do vary by locality, and part of that is just the nature of our federalist system, because you have in a community resilience framework, we think about how much local assets matter to taking action, and we think about this larger policy framework that determines kind of the steps that you can take. And in the context of like coal plant and mine closures, state policy is really influential and really different. So here's just a graphic from a paper that we worked on comparing kind of how state policy frameworks were shaping the steps that communities could take. And what we found is that, you know, the choices that states make were really having an influence on kind of where communities might be able to go in the context of the coal transition. Another factor, I'll just go through this one really quickly about the coal transition in the US, Amanda mentioned this, is like, this is a hugely complicated stakeholder landscape. So here's Colstrip, Montana. It's a tiny town, mine mouth power plant town out in eastern Montana. It has an enormously complex stakeholder landscape. That's because we have lots of different utility actors. They're in different states. They're governed by different state utility policies. And I think it's important to remember that it's not only the plant or the mine, it is all these features, both the critical infrastructure for those industrial features, whether that's railways or water supplies or transmission, and it's all of your community amenities. All of these things are affected by transition, and it requires that those local actors negotiate and work in these different networks of stakeholders, all of whom have different kind of accountability, potentially different policy and legal structures that they're working in. So it really is this tremendously complex kind of stakeholder landscape. So in that, after saying every place is a little bit different and unique, I'll just list a laundry list here of what I think are some of the really common kind of contextual factors facing coal-dependent communities. Often there's a significant amount of geographic and social and political isolation. I do think the scenarios that we've looked at that involve closing a plant in a large metropolitan area, whether that's Billings or Colorado Springs, I think those scenarios are really different than our more isolated interior West communities. So we know that economic dependence is a really significant issue, not just the jobs and income, but also that public revenue. And public revenue matters so much when you're trying to build towards economic diversification, because it is your local amenities and it is your trained workforce and all those things that public revenue contributes to that will really make a difference in your ability to attract and retain new businesses. So that fiscal cliff, as you've heard from both of these presentations, is huge. It's really common that there's a great amount of uncertainty about closures. I think that's changing. You know, we're getting closer and closer to knowing that plants really are going to close, but certainly the uncertainty that tends to surround closure dates works against, I think, the impulse to plan and take this seriously. That's really problematic. And then these are long duration transitions. They're going to play out over a number of years. And so that kind of endurance that the local leaders will need is really important. There is often very limited local capacity for that kind of planning activity. and the larger policy advocacy that sometimes needs to happen, like the example that we just heard about, maybe the state actually really needs to make a fiscal policy change in order to improve the opportunities for local school districts to respond to revenue loss. That's a lot for remote, isolated places often to take on. Something I think we also just touched on when we talked about the 13 school districts. It's just that there can be a real focus on the community that hosts the infrastructure, whether that's the mine or the plant, and sometimes a tendency to forget that these are regional effects. And certainly, like in southeastern Montana, a big issue we have is just making sure that we recognize the uneven capacity and outcomes that are affecting vulnerable populations, as in our Native American communities that don't host the plant but are closely tied to the mining industry. So that regional unevenness, I think, is a big issue. We heard about the challenges for community psychology, the grief that can lead to kind of hopelessness and some paralysis when it comes to taking action. We haven't talked today about risks of facility abandonment and kind of contamination. Those are things that local actors are concerned about and have to kind of stay on top of. And then I just mentioned like how complex the policy space is and the fact that there are some real policy failures, potentially, you know, the example of the school funding formula in Arizona is one of those. So these are all really common challenges, and not all of them are within the control of local actors or any, you know, geographic isolation is a really hard thing to change. But let me give you maybe just a few examples of things where I do see some positive action happening. And this is, I'm choosing 3 things to focus on just for the sake of time. That's not to say that there aren't positive things happening in all these spaces. So just taking that issue of lost property tax, that's something that I've worked on in my career quite a bit. And I do think it's just a really dramatic issue, and the loss of revenue can become so consuming, like responding to that loss of revenue can be so consuming just in terms of the everyday work of your school superintendent, your fire department, you know, all of that. If we can mitigate some of that, that creates some breathing room, I think, to sort of take part in these larger, like, kind of resilience actions. So a couple of examples I think are pretty positive come from Colorado, where we do see in the negotiated settlements around closure from the utilities to local governments, direct property tax relief. There's one that was recently announced around Moffat County and the plants in Craig, and then one that's slightly few years old now in the city of Pueblo, also a commitment to paying property tax revenue relief from the utility. So that gets rate-based, but it does just create some ability to, like, keep the lights on in those facilities. These are not perfect solutions, but just some examples. And one thing I want to just emphasize is go back to my comments at the beginning. When we think about these examples, the question is, like, what do we want to have happen and who can make this happen? So we want to see some property tax relief for local governments. Some of that might come from large scale policy change, but often in the coal transition space, who can make that happen is really, you know, sort of rate basing some of that relief over time if the state is not politically willing to kind of compensate for that property tax loss. So I think here is a place where utility actors really have some interest in thinking creatively about how they can put these settlement packages together. And I know, and I'm sure you'll learn a lot from the JET Center about kind of thinking about these strategies. So this idea of, like, the Gregg was talking about having to, like, coach the softball team, and sorry if I got the sport wrong, but, you know, do everything, wear every hat in communities. Like, this is huge. This shortage of capacity, not just to, like, take on planning, even if people wanted to participate in planning, which they often don't, but then do all this policy advocacy, you know, that to work on state and federal issues that are going to affect your community. Like, that's just huge as a barrier that some communities are facing. So I think when I look across the country, like, there's people are amazing what they get done. I think what we see coming out of Appalachia now is particularly exciting. I noticed there's someone from the Just Transition Fund on the call. I think their attention to that area has really helped. But just one example is thinking about Coalfield Development, which is a regional sort of economic development entity. They just won, I think, a $63 million Build Back Better EDA grant. And they're really able to do this because they have a strong regional identity, a long history of organizing, a set of issues that have been like really persistent for a long time. And I think this is just some hope and inspiration that you can kind of come up with that vision and build capacity, particularly if you're willing to collaborate at a regional scale. I think that is one of the things that really distinguishes some of the big ticket items that we see coming out of Appalachia versus what we see in some of our more isolated kind of Western cases. And I would just say, like, this is a moment where there's a huge amount of opportunity. So as a local entity addressing this, there's lots of support in philanthropy for capacity building. There are all kinds of programs to do peer-to-peer learning, both through the National Association of Counties and through the CSU Coal Academy program. There's lots of opportunities for individual actors in local communities to go out and kind of get the skills that they need. Amanda mentioned the AmeriCorps or VistaCorps program that's going to put volunteers in coal communities. I would say, like, in your higher ed institutions, there's lots of people that want hands-on experience supporting work. So thinking creatively about how academic partners potentially can provide some of that resource locally, I think is something that's very much possible. And then, of course, there's lots of federal resources right now through the Interagency Working Group and the newly established TIC-TACs as well, and many others that I'm not mentioning. And then finally, I want to give one example around that, the question of community psychology and the grief that's really an issue. And that's something I have watched develop in Ohio. And I was this summer lucky to attend this amazing theatrical performance. This is a performance called Calling Hours. And what it is about a 90-minute theatrical event. And in the play, there are speakers that get up as though they were giving a eulogy at a funeral. The funeral is for the coal plant. And their eulogies are all based on interviews done with members of the Coshocton, Ohio community about their memories and experiences with the coal plant. So this project was funded from some internal funds from Ohio State University. They brought the local arts program in Coshocton together with faculty from the theater program at OSU, and they put together this beautiful play. They gave it in the town of Coshocton the same summer that the plant was not only closed, but demolished. And then they recently gave it in Columbus. I was able to attend that. People who worked at the plant were in the audience, got up after the performance to talk about how moving and meaningful it was for them to have this opportunity to do some collective grieving over this entity that was so culturally and economically important to them. So I think we can think creatively about how do we create spaces for a dignified honoring of the loss of these industries in creative ways. I think those are all the examples that I have. And just, to close on a note of hope, here's a reminder from the Berlin Wall that nothing is forever, and we really can take action in ways that can improve our long-term future. So urge you to get in touch with me through the QR code and hope we can have a conversation after these slides. Thanks.
Julia, thanks so much. Such good information. And I know your slide deck's way longer, so sometime we're going to ask you to come back and present more of those. Before we go to questions for you, Robbie Kopernik with the Holbrook School District had put a comment in the chat, and I think he's unmuted, so he can just tell us about that, because he was talking about the specific impacts on his school district. So there you are.
Amanda, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for putting this together. There's a little bit of hope just listening to all of you guys, because it has been a little bit hopeless over the last, really since they made the announcement and all of our communities started to kind of grasp at what's next. And I can speak on behalf of the Holbrook Unified School District, and we're friends with Brian Fields from Joseph City, and I know that they're getting the brunt of the impact because we don't get the tax base. They get the tax base with, but what has been impactful for us is the loss of high quality people and professionals that are working in this, at the plant, and then their families. You know, a lot of their wives would teach for us, or they would work in some capacity for us. They might, obviously they're not working as teachers, they're working in the plant, but there's the family structures were always part of the school system. And of course, we have also lost students from that as well, because they started the transition early. They saw the writing on the wall. And that's why over the last 5 years, we've seen a 10% decline in our enrollment. And everything that Jeremy talked about is spot on in terms of tax-based loss, in terms of enrollment loss, in terms of, and not only enrollment loss that we are losing kids, but also that we're not attracting kids. So because Holbrook Unified School District is the largest employer in our community. So if people aren't coming here to work in the school district or our county, or potentially in the restaurant or hotel business, there's nothing else here. And so that's the plant was the stabilizing factor that really caused Holbrook to boom at one time. And now we're seeing the reverse effect of that. So there's a lot of byproducts to this. Holbrook is a great community. It's a very prideful community. It's a historic community, but we're also reliant upon having some basis of employment and some social factors, as well as economic factors that once came from the power plant. And we lost a teacher just this year because her husband, and she was teaching dual enrollment for us, and she went to high school here and had kids, you know, and now she's actually subbing for us right now, but they know that they're going to transition in November to a new job. And so that's a great example of how this is impacting us at this very point. And I just want to thank Amanda and everyone that has been, because you've been to our community, you've heard our people, we've done some work sessions, and I just wanted to let you know that this gives us a sense of hope that we're not alone, because we are very remote out here, but it helps to have this type of influence and these type of listening sessions, as well as the influence that is part of this group, because it gives me confidence, it gives our board confidence, it gives our teachers and our community confidence that we're not alone in this. So much appreciation for that.
And I just want to say for the record that I did not prompt Robbie to say all that stuff. So just want to make sure that's clear.
No, but it's real. It is very much real, because you know, it is lonely in these environments, and when things are not going in your favor, so to speak, it's hard to have the clout and the stature to be able to stand up and say, wait, what about us? And to have ASU part of this, and the Jets that are part of this is so important. So thank you.
Yeah, good. I'm going to go to Greg, and then I've got a couple of questions for Julia, and then we're going to give you a quick poll and get you out of here on time.
Yeah, I just want to respond to Robbie. Number one is that you have a tremendous asset in that I-40. And I definitely know what it feels like to be on an island by yourself. But with all of this news, basically I was a squeaky wheel. I want to say squeaky a wheel, but we're professional, so I'm not going to say that. But I was extremely squeaky in the wheel that I was. I called everyone I could, and I looked at the strengths that we had. Holbrook has a lot of strengths. And then it's just identifying, okay, who's going to come here and what are they going to do next? But you're going to get through this, Robbie. Like this, it seems bleak. I live this. I 100% live. I know exactly how you're feeling, but you will get through this, and Holbrook will rebound.
Thanks, Greg. And because we've got some people that have gone through this before, we're certainly going to pull on them. So Julia, for you, you had talked about that it was important to have a process or an organization or some kind of structure prior to closure. Can you give us a little bit of thoughts of like, what that might look like or who that organized that, or just some examples of what you've seen that's been successful?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that the answer would be there is not one specific like entity that fits everywhere. But any place where local actors are coming together to network and understand each other's, sort of institutional capacities and priorities is going to work. So we don't need necessarily, I mean, every community will know the answer to this question better than I. You might not need a whole new entity. Can you repurpose a set of kind of planning processes and adapt it? And that's just like a long-term finding from the planning literature, that in small places and under-resourced, capacity constrained places, it can be hard to like add another thing. So an example that we often cite that was really powerful in Eastern Montana, and this is again in the context of the shale boom, is that there is the local health district has to do a lot of coordinating in order to do their community health assessment and do their own strategic planning. They ended up, that network that they kind of put together ended up being a network that evolved to address a set of energy boom and bust impacts. And that was just because people were already in the habit of meeting and knew each other, and they could kind of take on that responsibility. So I think, it's going to be different in different places, but sort of looking around and asking, like, where are we already doing this is in ways that force us to reach out from beyond our organizational boundaries and make connections is my point there.
Thank you. The other thing I think we've not mentioned on this webinar is that when we talk about transition, it's not funding forever, that it may be money that goes down over time. And you showed slides on a bunch of different settlements. Is that what you've seen in these settlements, that, what's the time period? Is there a defined ramp? I mean, how does support show up?
Yeah, I think that is very much evolving, and I'm not aware of like a sort of complete assessment of that. And I think that how do I want to answer that? I think each one is like sort of reflecting very different conditions, and that not everybody's going to be happy with that, so how long will the transition support last? It kind of depends on what form it comes in. In some cases, it is going into some kind of a permanent fund that can be used, at the community's discretion. In other cases, like those examples are just about property tax relief. And I think in both cases, it's roughly a decade of support. So it's nowhere near enough. And certainly advocating in settlements and then making sure you have the institutional capacity to absorb it, advocating for some kind of permanent fund that can be used either for revolving loans or other kinds of like long-term investments, I think is super, super important. And I'm not enough of like, you're more of a utility expert, law expert than I am, Amanda, to understand like how much that can be built into rate cases, but that would be what you're looking for.
Yeah, and I think one of the things we've found with our research is that there is no cookie cutter approach. There is no best practice approach. You had the federal base closure that had a process, and everybody knew what they were supposed to be doing. And we don't have that in Arizona, and we haven't really seen that anywhere in the US. So we're always looking for good examples. So I want to thank Jeremy, Gregg, and Julia. I learned a lot. I thought it was absolutely fantastic dialogue and a great way to kick off this session. We are going to go to a poll because we want to see if we hit the mark. And so if Ty will put up the poll while you're reading that, maybe you can multitask. We are going to have 2 more webinars. Actually, let me give you a minute just to read through that and answer that poll, if you will, and then I'll talk at you again. Okay. So we are building these webinars. We wanted to host this one to set the stage. So we have a little bit of a landscape about what's happening and what could happen. The next webinar we have is on September 3rd. And for the next two webinars, we're going to talk about where could transition support come from. The next webinar is going to talk about utility and state support for transition. And we've got some in-state and out-of-state speakers that are going to come and tell us how they did it in their states. Then we've got our final webinar on September 10th, which is talking about tapping federal resources. So we have a federal funding rep that's going to come. And then we have some local expertise that are going to talk about what they're doing to try to help other people and themselves get federal funding. So I appreciate everybody's attendance today. I want to give a round of applause to our speakers who I thought were great. We are taping these. We will post them on the JET website. We will make that available to everyone. And then if this spurred any conversation, any thoughts, please, if you just Google Arizona State University Just Energy Transition Center, you will find us. There's an email there to be able to contact us. So I appreciate everybody's time today, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. So thanks very much, everybody.